Okay, so slide number 9 said problems with input industry argument, right? So because of this, they failed. The ISI strategy failed. So featured by very low growth rates, right? And instead of this, East Asian countries showing higher, much higher growth rates, right? Much higher growth rates, that kind of thing. And because of this protection, so Latin America's domestic production or manufacturing is not failed to become mature, to become competent, right? So lots of problem happened in Latin American country from 1970s to 1980s. Actually, problem starts in 1960s, late 1960s. And Latin American countries show some foreign exchange shortage crisis and debt crisis. They borrow lots of money, right? So using same resources, the economy cannot grow much rapidly because no reason to do that, right? Then what happened? Using same labor and capital stock and technology is almost constant, right? Technology is almost constant. Using this, GDP doesn't increase greatly. For example, 1%, 2% like this. So I explained 70 rules, 70 over G. If Korea growth rate is 10%, per capita GDP doubled in 7 years, right? Latin America, for example, one country's growth just 1% per annum, then 70 years requires to double per capita GDP or GDP. 70 years, 7, right? In this period, Korea is much poor country. Our per capita GDP is lower than Philippines and other countries, much lower than Philippines and the other countries. And Brazil or Argentina was almost a developed level at the time, but in terms of per capita GDP. Now everything changed because of this. The secret is this. Growth rate, 1%, 10%. Then, for example, Korea's per capita GDP is $10, for example, right? And one Latin American country's GDP is 100%, $100, and growth rate is 10% and 1%. Then, after 14 years, for example, then what happened? 20, 40, like this, right? This example requires lots of explanation. For example, Korea is just half of some Latin American countries, right? And growth rate is 10%. That is 1%. Okay, 110. Then after 70 years, Latin American countries' GDP doubled to $20, right? What happened in Korea? Every 7 years doubled. So doubled 10 times. That means 1 multiplied by like this. I don't know how to calculate. Then our per capita GDP is $100 after 70 years. So everything changes, right? So then what happened in Latin American countries? Latin American countries, GDP doesn't increase greatly, and lots of some unemployment problem happen. Unemployment problem is really severe. In Korea, unemployment rate is very low until 1990s, actually. But Latin American countries from 1960s, very high unemployment rate. They need a job, and they strike against government. Give me a job. Then what happened? Okay, no problem. Latin American governments won't have to solve some unemployment problem. by hiring more public servants. Okay? Public servants. So numbers of public servants in Latin America increase greatly. But how to pay for them? Usually government, after collection of tax and tariff, they support public servants, right? But the industry level is very low in Latin American countries. The government have no money to support, to pay the role. Then how to happen? Borrow money from overseas. Okay, borrow money from United States and Europe. That really happened in Latin American countries. Then what happened? Debt crisis happened. Started from 1960s. Debt crisis. Also foreign exchange shortage problems. Right? Like IMF crisis in Korea. They experience debt crisis and foreign exchange shortage crisis repeatedly. Brazil, Mexico, Canada, Argentina, more than almost 20 times repeatedly. Okay? We said macroeconomic unemployment problem and macroeconomic instability happen. Okay? So they gave up to insist on ISI and moving to EOI. That is liberalization after 1985. Okay? And slide number 10. Two arguments how market failure prevent infant industry from becoming competitive. Right? That is a more elaborate explanation for number 3. Right? And this is actually market in developed countries. It's really difficult to find market failure problem. But developing countries featured by the lots of imperfect some market failures. Okay, that is explained. Imperfect financial asset market, blah blah blah. Because of poorly working financial laws and market, firms cannot or do not save and borrow to invest sufficiently in their production process. Okay, because of financial market, asset market function is not established. Firms cannot borrow and save and invest. It's not that kind of activity is really difficult. So problem. That is market failure. If creating better functioning market and enforcing law is not feasible, enforcement of law is not so feasible, then high tariff would be second best policy to increase profit in new industries, blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing happen. And the problems of appropriability. Firms may not be able to privately appropriate the benefit of their investments in new industries because those benefits are public goods. Right? The knowledge created when starting on something, not be appropriable because of lack of a property right. If establishing a system of property rights is blah, blah, blah. Anyway, in case of Korea, this one is important. Firms may not be able to privately appropriate the benefit of their investment in new industry because those benefits are public goods, blah, blah. Right? So so infant industry argument when market fails is okay. Right? Acceptable. Right? So regarding this imperfect financial asset market, now think about, 산업은행. So what is the name of 산업은행 in English? Not industrial bank. I'm not sure. Industrial bank. So in English we said English bank. Industrial bank. And export and import bank. What is this? Right? When developing countries start industrialization, lots of money, long-term loan required to establish factories, to establish a car factory or semiconductor factory, lots of money required. How to organize this kind of money? So, industrial bank and export-import bank is innovation to solve that kind of problem. This kind of banks, establishment of this kind of bank is some innovation, humankind's innovation to solve financial market failures. Okay? So firstly, this one is developed in 19th century in Germany. Early 19th century and late 18th century. Early 19th century, Germany was a developing country at the time. United Kingdom is only one developed one, right? And also France was developed one. At the time, Germany was developing countries, right? Germany want to industrialize their country, investing a lot in iron and steel, electricity, electrical and auto assembly, for example, right? But where does this money come from? So German people innovate this kind of thing to solve financial problem, financial market failures, right? And this kind of some development innovation strategy is exported to in Japan in 20th century. So Japan established Industrial Bank of Japan, Export-Import Bank of Japan, like this. Their main purpose is long-term loan to firms. Long-term loan to firms with low interest rate to support some firms' entrance into potential comparative advantage sector. Can you understand? Also, Korea government mimic Japanese experience. So we also established Industrial Bank of Korea, Export and Import Bank of Korea in developing stages, right? So in that sense, that is number third reason in also important. Okay? And slide number 12. Important instituting industrialization in Latin American countries worked to encourage manufacturing industries in the 1950s and 1960s. But economic development, not encouraging manufacturing, was the ultimate goal of the policy. Ultimate goal of the policy is economic development instead of encouraging manufacturing. So that is a criticism. Actually, if some Brazil or Argentina, right, insists on their comparative advantage sector, in other words, agricultural sector, then it's possible these two countries now developed one. Think about Canada or Australia. These two countries' main industry is agriculture, but high-income countries, developed countries, right? But these countries want to transform to manufacturing, want to shift from agriculture to manufacturing-centered economic development, right? So ultimate goal is economic development. In other words, increasing per capita GDP, not increase manufacturing. Did ISI promote economic development? So at this point, absolutely no. That is the economist conclusion in 1970s and 1980s. Absolutely no. Countries adopting ISI grew more slowly than other countries. For example, adopt EOI. Can you understand? So Latin American countries are troubled by unemployment problem and macroeconomic instability, right? Repeatedly, more than almost 20 times until now. So they changed to EOI. Can you understand? That is ISI. It appeared that the infant industry argument was not as valid as some had initially believed. New industries did not become competitive despite or because of trade restriction. Because of protection, no incentive to become competitive. Okay? That happened in developing countries, especially in Latin America. Import-substitute industrialization involves cost and promoted wasteful use of resources. Involved cost, right? So high tariff means consumers purchase domestically produced car with higher cost than otherwise, right? And the government use lots of money to support them, but that is wasteful use, wasteful. just wasteful. It involved complex, time-consuming regulations. It sets high tariff rates for consumers, including firms that need to purchase imported inputs. I already explained that parts and components imported from others for their products. It promoted inefficiently small industries. So size of a firm of ISI is very small firms. So we studied scale economy really matter after Second World War, right? But size of firm is very small. So just small and medium-sized company exist to produce car. So cost very high, and scale economies benefit of they cannot enjoy scale economies. They lost the chance to enjoy scale economies. Firm is always small and medium size instead of large, right? It promoted inefficiency through small industries. So now section 2, trade liberalization after 1985. So some low and middle income countries that had relatively free trade had a higher average economic growth than those that followed ISI, right? So now think about East Asian countries who are showing highest growth rates, right? Higher growth rates than ISI countries. By the mid-1980s, many governments, including Latin America, had lost faith in import substituting strategy and they began to liberalize trade. So we can see after 1980s, dramatic fall in tariff rates. Tariff rates decrease and decrease in these countries. That means liberalization happened. That means their developmental strategy changes from ISI to EOI, right? And less drastic reduction in many other developing countries. Trade liberalization in developing countries occurred along with a dramatic increase in volume of trade. The share of trade in GDP has tripled over 1970, 1998, with most of the growth happening after 1985. So I already explained before 1980s, the reason for rapid economic growth of EOI is volume of exports and openness, export and import share in GDP, right? The share of trade in GDP, that is openness, has tripled over this period. The share of manufacturing goods in developing countries, exports surged, coming to dominate the exports of the biggest developing economies. So we can see development of manufacturing exports after 1980s, especially in Latin American countries. A number of developing countries have achieved extraordinary growth. A number of developing countries who adopt EOI show extraordinary growth rates, extraordinary high growth rates, right? While becoming more, not less open to trade. So that is the secret of extraordinary growth, exports volume and openness, import and export share in GDP, right? That is economist conclusion, right? Until in this period. Trade liberalization in developing countries occurred along with, I already explained this. Now we go 16. So figure 11 shows tariff rates in developing countries. India, Brazil. This is the country who adopt ISI before 1985, right? 1985. Before that, for example, India decreased dramatically in this 1990s, like this, right? One measure of a shift away from ISI is a sharp drop in tariff rates. Sharp drop in tariff rates indicating some countries, ISI countries, change their policy, trade policy, okay? So growth of developing countries of trade. So now look at this. Exports volume, especially increase like this. Originally in this one is usually by East Asian countries, but from 1985, right? This one growth rates increased from mid-1980s. The slope higher, right? Because all the developing countries now adopt EOI. All the developing countries adopt EOI. So trade liberalization promoted development. The evidence is mixed. Based on the performance before 1985, right? EOI, so trade liberalization or EOI, right, is trade liberalization promoted development? Definitely yes, considering these countries, East Asian countries, right? But from 1985, all the developing countries adopted EOI, and I ask you, what's the reason for rapid economic? What's the reason? So trade volume or this EOI policy increased growth rate? Answer is mixed, right? Change it. Answer for same question, change it. When the sample is East Asian countries, definitely yes. But if we include Latin American countries, mixed. All right? That is here. Evidence is mixed. Growth rates in Brazil and other Latin American countries have been slower since trade liberalization. They were during ISR industrialization. I already explained. Growth rates in this period, IS period of Latin American countries, growth rates in ISR period, and growth rates of Latin America after transforming EOI, we compare these two, nothing changed, almost same. So we said mixed. So Latin American countries, doubted, right? But after 1985, we can show answer is yes for some countries. That is, number one is China, number two is India. Can you understand? Right? So China and India also adopt sort of ISI strategy before 1985. But after 1985, we can find success. Right? Trade, liberalization, result in rapid economic growth. That happened in China and India. But Latin American countries, doubted. Okay? So because of this, Latin American countries' growth rates failed in IS period. After transforming to EOI, still not so successful. Can you understand? Well, why? So this, when we Korea, in the period of FTA talk with Korea-US FTA, lots of some people argued. They object Korean-US FTA. At that time, basic reason why they oppose free trade with China, that is this. After Latin American countries transformed to EOI, or after concluding NAFTA, their growth rates decrease. But their argument is totally misleading. Why? Growth rates of Latin American countries doesn't increase greatly after changing, after the shift. Why? That is a result of this one. I already explained that because of a problem of ISI, they experience repeated macroeconomic instability, debt crisis and financial shortage crisis repeatedly. Because of that, growth rate is very low. Okay? Not because EOI is not so good, but because accumulated problem in ISI period. Okay? That is explained here. But unstable macroeconomic policies and financial crisis contributed to slower growth since the 1980s. Can you understand? Because of this, some Korean activist arguments to oppose free trade with the United States is totally misleading. They use quite different some argument. And slide number 19. Other countries like India have grown rapidly since liberalizing trade in 1980s, but it is unclear to what degree of liberalization trade contributed to growth. Question is, what degree liberalized trade contributed to growth? In this period, absolutely yes, right? But after that, mixed. Okay? Some economists also argue that trade liberalization has contributed to income inequality as Hack-Shawlin model predicts. Okay? That is idea. And now we go section number 3. Trade and growth, take up in East Asia. Instead of ISI, several countries in East Asia adopted trade policy that promoted exports in targeted industries. So Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and after 1985, China have experienced rapid growth in various export sectors and rapid economic growth in general. These high-performance Asian economies, right? So sometimes high-performing East Asian economies, right? Generate a high volume of exports and imports relative to total production. So this East Asian countries showing this one, high exports and high openness share, right? And until 1985, before Latin American countries shifted to EOI, that is the answer, right? But we know that Latin American countries' performance is not so spectacular after 1985. So economists' judgment is slightly changed like this. Their policy reforms were followed by a large increase in openness as measured by export share of exports in GDP. So it is possible to develop through export-oriented growth, EOI, right? However, Latin American countries, nations such as Mexico, Brazil, which also sharply liberalized trade and shifted towards EOI after 1985, did not see comparable economic take-up. These Latin American results suggest that other factors must have played a crucial role in East Asian miracle. So high growth rate is a miracle, right? East Asian miracle, the reason for East Asian miracle is exports and openness until 1985. But after Latin America country shift to EOI and failed, right? The important reason is changes. That is not major one. But this one I already explained. Accumulation of capital, accumulation of human capital, and institutional reform. Okay, that is explained here. Okay, so East Asian take-up, not so important. So Asia surge in trade, volume of exports and imports like this, right? It's unclear if the high volume of exports and imports caused rapid economic growth. That was a belief before 1985. But after considering experience in Latin American country after 1985, something changes. Maybe exports growth, volume of exports and imports was correlated with rapid economic growth. But there are other factors, right? Exports, high growth rates. In this earlier arguments that, right? Exports and imports are reason for high growth rate, right? But we considering Latin American countries' experience believe that there are other factors increasing exports growth rate, simultaneously increase higher growth rate. That is more important. That is not the main reason for rapid economic growth, but the others. The others is this one. Accumulation of capital, accumulation of human capital, and institutional factors, right? So number one reason is change in capital. High saving and investment rates could have led to both rapid economic growth in general and rapid economic growth in export sector simultaneously. The number one reason is change in capital. So import share or export share, investment rate or saving rate, right? So until 1980s, saving rate or investment rate in Korea is more than 30% and more than 25% and 30% like that. But the other developing countries showing very low saving and investment rate. Saving is investment anyway, after all, right? So saving means investment rate, saving rate increase, then investment increase, right? investment is change in capital stock is need. So high investment rate, high saving rate means accumulation of capital. Can you understand? That is number one reason. The second reason is rapid growth in education leads to high literacy and numerous rates important to productive labor force. What is number two? Change in human capital. So explained by rapid growth in education. Education is human capital investment in human capital, right? So, for example, now until early 1980s, 1980s, most workers, most laborers, right, terminate some high school, and then they become a labor. Okay, so their schooling years is 60. Primary school 6 years, middle and high school 6 years, so in total 12 years. Schooling years was usually 12, but now 16 because most of workers receive college education, right? Then what is the meaning of this? So we know that in production function, labor is L, simply talking, right? But this one we can say like this, H multiplied by N. N is number of workers or hours of labor, right? And H is average skills of workers, So education increase, college educated workers increase, then each average labor's productivity increase greatly. Can you understand? Actually, that is human capital. Human capital is numbers of labor, hours of labor multiplied by some average labor skill. So education increase, then workers, schooling years increase, right? So workers become more productive than before because lots of education. This is a reason for rapid economic growth, East Asian miracle. Can you understand? So that is number two argument. Okay, for example, high school workers cook pizza, 10 pizza per hour, for example, right? And college graduate workers can cook 20 pizza per hour, for example. That's the reason why college educated workers receive 2 times wage rate of high school wage rate, right? So this one, that is human capital story. Can you understand? That is, so there are two ways of increasing productivity of labor. Number one is education. The other is on-the-job training in economics, right? Education results in higher general job skills, right? General job skills. This one increase generally. That means after graduate, schooling years increase. General job, there are lots of job skills, but this job skill can be applied in carpenter or pizza cooker or some automakers like this, right? So higher the job skills accumulated by education can be applied in various areas. That is general job skill. General job skill accumulated by formal education. That's the reason for education, right? And the other way of increasing labor's productivity is on-the-job training. On-the-job training increase specific job skill. Specific job skills. Specific job skill means after this training, usually OJT is arranged by company, firm, right? So specific job skill means that firm specific skills. After OJT, labor's productivity increase, but this job skill only applied in that firm, that job only. Can you understand? Right? That is this OJT and burdened by that company because that company benefit from this OJT. Can you understand? General job skill and specific job skill. Anyway, that kind of thing is second reason of East Asian miracle. East Asian miracle. Okay, that is second reason of East Asian miracle. Number 3, these nations also undertook their other economic reform. Lots of economic reforms, successful. But Latin American countries failed because of, for example, lots of some political problem, right? Political problem prevalent in Latin America, right? So resort to mass, right? And human rights. But economic reform is really difficult, hard one, right? So if we look at potential growth rates of developed countries, per capita GDP per annum, in the very long run, per capita GDP growth increased by 1.8%, right? For developed countries, per annum, 1.8%, right? But that is developed countries' case based on economics. But developing countries' potential growth rate is much higher than this. For example, 30.6% like this. Much higher than potential growth rates in developing countries. Okay? But if we look at real growth rates of developed countries, is near 1.8%. That is, for example, like this. That is 1.8%. Right? So, like this. But developing countries' case, that is average 30.6%. Successful countries is showing very high one, over 36%. But unsuccessful developing countries showing very low, smaller than 1.8%. For example, 1% like this. There are lots of growth rates. Right? So average growth rate of developing countries, average growth rate of older developing countries lower than 1.8%. Why did that happen? Actually, developing countries can grow much faster than developed countries. But problem is institutional problem, structural problem, political problem. So reform happened, right? Economic reform happened. Then some countries showing much higher growth rates, like Korea and Japan. Our growth rates so over 10%, right? China also showing higher than 10%. Why did that happen? Anyway, they solved some structural and institutional problem because of successful economic reform. But Latin American countries, they failed actually economic reform. Their growth rate is much lower than average of developed countries. Okay? So that is really important. Also, I'd like to just add one more thing, one final and critical question. Why Latin American countries failed to show higher growth rates than earlier period, where at the time they adopt ISI? Why? Their growth rate doesn't increase greatly after transition to EOI. That is, if we can answer using some world market situation. Okay? If we look at world, so, okay, number one, I would like to explain nature of EOI. For example, Korea, developing countries featured by low per capita GDP, right? So purchasing power of developing countries is very low. So high-performing, some developing countries have to export that to world market instead of domestic market because local market is too small, right? So Korea exports lots of goods to U.S. and European countries, right? The share decrease, but until 1990s, most of goods exported to United States, developed countries actually. The market for EOI is developed countries. That is number one reason, right? Developed countries. But developed countries' economic situation get worse and worse. They are reaching at some peak point in 1960s. After that, developed countries' economic situation get worse and worse and worse. So unemployment rate increase and increase and increase. Okay? But EOI targeted exports domestically produced goods to developed countries. So market condition is not so good. Deteriorated. So fortunately, before 1985, only small range of developing countries adopted EOI. So anyway, they have a chance to export lots of products to developed countries. Right? So we are very lucky. But after 1985, what happened? All the developing countries adopt EOI and want to export their products to same market. But the market situation gets worse and worse, as I said before, right? Market size is same. But competitors, all the developing countries, right? So intensity of competition in developed countries among developing countries who adopt the EOI intensified. So only small range of countries successful. That is China and India. Okay? So actually I don't like some development or that kind of issue because they usually development economies are from Indian origin or Latin American origin. And in Latin American origin economies just experience failure and failure again after 1985. Okay? So their idea is very skeptical, critical. Okay? So, but they are majority in development economics. So they exaggerate some sad story. But Korea is quite different, isn't it? Success story. Very lucky situation. Now still enjoys higher growth rates than the countries. Okay, so that is my final point in chapter 11. Thank you.